I'm Will.
And I'm Luke.
And this is Will and Luke Discuss,
a vodcast
and podcast
where we discuss content related to psychology,
personal growth,
self-development,
and well-being. This episode, we're discussing
Schema Therapy, a Practitioner's Guide by Jeffrey Young, Janet Klosko, and Marjorie Vaishar.
Wonderful. Okay, well, I'm keen to learn a bit more about what you've learned, and this time I'll be interviewing you about what you've picked up along the way since reading this book. So I think a really probably a basic place to start for my learning and just kind of a bit of a refresher is what is a schema and what is the overall preface of this book, and then we can crack into some of the content.
Great. I'll start with the second one. The overall preface of the book is it says in the subtitle, it's a practitioner's guide. So for someone who's learning schema therapy as a therapist, they even name it in the preface as the Bible for anyone wanting to practice schema therapy. So that's the book's function. I think for you and me and for this podcast, I'd like to view it through the lens more of how can anyone who cares about self-help and personal development learn lessons from it.
Wonderful.
In terms of a schema, there's a couple of definitions. One's much broader and one's much narrower. So I'll start with the broader one. Right?
Yeah.
A schema is like an internal map or representation we have, psychological representation we have of an aspect of how the world works. And we learn them through experience, and they function as guides for us to make predictions and guide our behavior. So let's say I have a Wetherspoon schema. Now, this is just going to be for British audiences, but Wetherspoon is a British chain pub. But if I went to a Wetherspoon I've never been to before, I would know exactly how to order and how it works, when I pay, how I pay, and I would just feel comfortable functioning in that environment, even though I've never been to that particular pub before, but I've got an internal map of how the place works, right? So I can just go in, I can go in and I can function well. And you could say, maybe I've got just a broad pub schema. So when you go to a British pub, you go to the bar, you order your drink. You could either set up a tab or pay for your drink there, and that's all learned, that's all built in. Whereas, let's say I went to a foreign country, I went to some Greek taverna, and I started trying to apply my pub schema, I might get a few things wrong. I might embarrass myself and try and go to the bar and order. They're like, "Oh no, take a seat, we'll come to you," and I'm all flustered and confused because my predictions about the world are incorrect now because I'm projecting a schema onto a different environment that doesn't fit anymore.
Yes. Okay. And where do we broadly get these schemas from? How are they learnt and how are they sort of ingrained into us?
Yeah, we just learn them from patterns of repeated similar experiences. So the more you go to a bunch of different pubs and the more just the same actions are required to do the same things, it's like procedural learning. It's like how do you ride a bike you've never ridden before? Well, you've got so much inbuilt muscle memory of how to ride a bike that over time that you've learned it. And so you just apply that schema to this new bike.
Okay, yeah. And I guess from reading through some of the notes and getting familiar with some of the content, it seems like these can be beneficial to us or detrimental to us. Is there a way that these are categorized or a way of kind of understanding them through a certain lens or any further definitions for the
definitely. So that was the raw definition of a schema. And as you can hear, they're generally really helpful. That we couldn't function in life if we didn't build patterns of experience that we can project onto new scenarios. We'd just be too overwhelmed at doing anything new. Because if I go to a new city, I know how the roads work, I know how the bus system works. I can project old patterns of behavior onto new environments that generally function pretty well. And with most schemas, they're flexible enough that when my when my current schema doesn't quite work, when there's novelty, it's fine. I can handle that. I can learn this new bit of information. I can assimilate it, and I can flexibly adapt my schema accordingly, right? So, in the taverna example, I might be taken aback slightly, but oh, no problem. I'll go take a seat, and then you'll come over and take my order. That's fine. I've adapted. So that's the broad definition of any psychological schema. That's not really what we're talking about specifically in schema therapy. So now what we're talking about in schema therapy is what they call early maladaptive schemas. So these are schemas specifically built around our unmet emotional needs. So whereas any other schemas we talked about are just built around general life experience, these are particularly built around our emotional needs having gone unmet, maybe predictably or repeatedly.
I was reading through they say they've got a comprehensive definition of an early maladaptive schema. So I might kind of read out that short list, and if there's any you wanted to expand on, I'll be really keen to hear which one you feel is most particularly relevant. But so it says a broad pervasive theme or pattern, which you mentioned, comprised of memories, emotions, cognitions, and bodily sensations regarding oneself and one's relationship with others. I'd love to hear a bit more on that from you. Developed during childhood or adolescence, elaborated through one's lifetime, and dysfunctional to a significant degree.
Yeah. So because these schemas are built around needs going unmet, they're inherently threats, right? So
right, yeah.
It's like, how do I make sense of this situation when my needs aren't going unmet, and therefore, because it's, I suppose we can get into this, but because it's threats, the schemas we build around these situations can become more rigid, more pervasive, more reluctant to change. We're more likely to sort of project them onto new situations in the future rather than adapt them based on the flexible changing of circumstances.
Okay, is that because they've worked before in other situations, so we expect them to work in this situation?
Yeah, that, and the fact that they were key for our survival, right? So if I've been abandoned, and I've got this abandonment schema, I'm gonna view anyone I get close to in the future through the lens of someone I need to predict that they're going to abandon me somehow. I'm going to start projecting and predicting and viewing their behaviors through signs that I'm going to get abandoned again. And that can even become self-fulfilling. And I'm going to be reluctant to flexibly changing that perspective, because it's that better safe or sorry perspective, right? If I keep it the same, at least I've got a chance of predicting a dangerous scenario and potentially kind of looking after myself. Whereas if I risk changing it, yes, I risk having a closer and safer relationship, but I also risk actually being abandoned again in a way that I don't have defenses for.
Yes. Okay. I I can imagine there's many different types of schema and many names for schemas and many functions of schemas, but was curious on the origin of them. That's something that caught my eye. What is it around, the core emotional needs? I'm wondering if you might be able to kind of share around what those core emotional needs are. So you mentioned one around maybe something like insecure attachments and fear of abandonment and safety, potentially being one of them. Are there others that are useful to know about? Yeah,
so they suggest we have 5 basic emotional needs, and we need them all kind of throughout life, but we particularly learn how they go met or unmet, in childhood and adolescence. So the first one is that sense of security or safety, which as human beings comes from a secure attachment to, parents, but the people who take care of us, because we're so dependent when we're young. Our sense of safety inherently comes from our caregivers. Yeah.
Mhm.
So a sense, and yeah, there's a bunch of schemas that can come out of that one need. So that's probably worth saying, is that there are 5 needs, but they go on to list like 18 schemas. So like each need can, depending on how it goes unmet, can sort of foster different schemas, different beliefs about the world, different predictions.
Yeah. Okay, that's helpful, because I think I was getting slightly confused with, what's a schema, what's a need, what's a domain.
Right.
Maybe I don't know if that's sort of something you can expand on
Yeah,
as we move forward. But I guess we were on the core emotional needs. But maybe after that we can hear a bit more about the rest. Yeah.
Yeah. So we've got, let's do that. So we've got these core emotional needs that's easy enough to understand, right? So safety and security is one. Another one is autonomy, competence, and identity. So the sense of being sort of free to I suppose like live up to your potential, to learn, to build skills, to explore by yourself, knowing that you can come back to your sense of secure and stable upbringing, but that you're not sort of held in from exploring yourself and learning skills and gaining competence out there in the world, right? The third one is freedom to express emotions and needs. So, I don't know. As a boy, am I free to cry, or as a girl, am I free to be angry? Might be stereotypes. Am I free to express what I need, or is that kind of squashed and not allowed in my environment?
Yeah.
Number 4 is spontaneity and play. Is play allowed, or am I living in an environment that's kind of like grim and fun is sort of frowned upon? And finally, number 5, do I have limits, a sense of at least realistic or reasonable limits? So obviously, I don't know, I might be free to play and express my needs, but there's a point at which I can't do that if I'm hurting other people. Like, there needs to be some boundaries set on my behavior, some sense of self-control.
Yes. Okay. Interesting. So they're the 5 core emotional needs, and then I guess just to kind of wrap up some of the definitional side of things. I'm just laughing because I know how big that coffee jug is. Yeah. Can you describe what the difference between domains are?
Yeah.
What are they?
So we got the 5 needs. And there are different ways in which each of those 5 needs can go unmet. And a need that's gone unmet becomes a domain for that, I don't know, package of schemas. So, for example, if our first need is for security and safety, then that going unmet becomes the domain of disconnection and rejection.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay.
So the need going unmet becomes a domain of a number of different schemas.
Okay. And could you give an example for, so we've got the other domains here. So we've got domain 2, which is impaired autonomy and performance.
Yeah.
Domain 3 is impaired limits. So domain 4. Yeah.
Yeah. So the impaired autonomy and performance obviously goes along for that need for autonomy and performance, right? And competence.
Yes.
Yeah. And impaired limits goes along with that need for realistic boundaries on our behavior. Yeah.
And what about other directness?
Other directedness. Yeah, that goes along with our freedom, the need to be free to express our feelings and needs.
Yeah.
If we're not free to do that because we have to be so focused on the minds and the lives and the feelings of other people. For example, if I become a caretaker to my own parent, then I'm not really free to express my own feelings and needs. I'm more directed and vigilant about their needs and feelings.
Yes. Okay.
So that'd be other directedness. Yeah.
Thanks for explaining that. That was I didn't quite have a clue what that meant. Thank you. And then domain 5, overvigilance and inhibition.
Yeah.
I can imagine that's where, if you've kind of got I'm going to try and join in here.
Sorry, go for it.
No, because I'm trying to, it might help me understand. So overvigilance and inhibition, would that be around having schemas of, I don't know, being afraid to play, or not feeling like you're able to be spontaneous, so that kind of inhibits your ability to kind of act and explore in the world.
Real. Yeah,
And I guess, or overvigilance would be sort of maybe coming from a fear-based response. Of that fight or flight.
Yeah, because if I express like spontaneity or play, I might predict based on my schemas that that's going to be, I don't know, shamed or something, or squashed or not allowed in some way.
Okay,
not engaged with. Yeah.
Yeah. And I guess a final definition I was interested in hearing before maybe we can kind of just speak a bit more freely about this and how it might apply to people on a day-to-day basis was the difference between unconditional schemas and conditional schemas. Be keen to hear what the differences between those.
Oh, that's a question.
Or maybe could explain some examples of them, and then that might help us understand.
I think I want to. I might get this wrong, but if I remember, a conditional schema is a schema that's. So if I remember an example, so in that other directedness example, one of the schemas is subjugation, right? Where you sacrifice your own feelings and needs for other people's. That becomes your worldview.
Okay.
And I think by conditional, it's conditional to the degree that you can protect yourself from your schema being triggered to the degree that you're able to maintain that subjugation. Okay. So if I successfully subjugate myself and I don't, it's like the real pain of the schema is how it feels when I express my needs and emotions and they get, I don't know, ignored, dismissed, punished, something like that, right?
Okay.
But if I'm able to suppress them and just focus on the other person's feelings and needs, it might be tiresome and unpleasant, but I'm not triggering that core pain of expressing myself and it going unmet.
Okay. Yep.
I think whereas the ones which are unconditional, I think you're more at risk of just feeling the pure pain of, like the abandonment one. I might just feel like you're abandoning me, and that hurts directly to my need to be to feel safe and secure in our relationship.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I think that's explaining. So I did have a couple notes here that sort of I might
go for it.
Related. So one was unconditional schemas hold out no hope. So no matter what the individual does, the outcome will be the same. Mm-hmm. Encapsulates what was done to the child without the child having any choice in the matter. And then, as what you were saying, I think you've described it perfectly, mate. Conditional schemas hold out the possibility of the hope. The individual can subjugate, self-sacrifice, seek approval, inhibit emotions, or strive to meet standards, and in doing so, perhaps avert the negative outcome, at least temporarily.
Yeah.
So there's me cheating by reading some notes. You did describe it well. So I think you've done a really great job describing those. I think it probably is important to understand what schemas are, where they come from, what are some of these core emotional needs. I'm wondering if there's a way of just expanding on this and potentially trying to apply this more to a self-development, self-knowledge side of things. I guess what comes to mind for me is, around the more we understand ourselves, we understand, what our triggers are, what some of the stimuli are for some of our more unhelpful or unwise behaviors, or things that reactions to certain events that we find repetitively happening in our lives, or certain things that go on that we feel unsettled by. I think it links into maybe things around, attachment, motivation, sense of rejection, sense of autonomy. It seems like it really just touches every single part of our lives and how we react and respond to things. I wonder if, kind of outside of a therapy setting, what sort of ideas or key messages you think could be applied to the, kind of self-development? Well,
I think in terms of self-development, it begs the question, or maybe we could ask the question, what's the problem? Like, or how might this lead to more suffering than is necessary, right?
Yes.
And so schemas, like I said right at the start, they're inherently not a problem. They're helpful maps of that help us guide potentially novel or new situations with things we've learned in the past. So that's a really helpful. I don't want to sort of make them sound too negative. Like, inherently, they're really helpful things for human beings to know how to do, so we can function in life. Right? They become unhelpful when, firstly, when we apply an old schema to a new situation and the new situation is sufficiently different, then it becomes dysfunctional, right? Because our predictions are incorrect to the current situation. If I'm, and then therefore my behavior might not be, I don't know, based on a rational appraisal of what's actually happening here.
Okay.
If I think you're like now judging me and criticizing me because I've been judged and criticized in the past, I might feel anxious and defensive, and that might guide the way how much I open up to you, and like I might snap back at you, for example, and suddenly this is becoming dysfunctional, right? Because it's not accurate to the current situation.
So it's kind of like treating your new boss with the level of I don't know, disagreeableness that you treated your old boss with, or something like that. So any sort of, I don't know, for example, like getting any level of like feedback, you would feel sensitive to and respond in the same way. As an example, just kind of something that comes to mind, or going into a new relationship with similar responses to unmet or unmet emotional needs potentially. Yeah.
And even that isn't the worst problem in the world, apart from, because these schemas are inherently threats, like I mentioned earlier, they become rigid and perpetuating, and really, really reluctant to change based on new information and new experiences. So that's when they really become problems.
I guess that kind of begs the question to me, and I think it'd be useful kind of as we go on, just kind of throw in names of schemas. But it begs the question, what level of psychological flexibility can we add into our lives when we feel like we might be responding, kind of in an old way to a new situation that's unhelpful, whether that's kind of, whether that's meeting new people, responding to work colleagues, responding to friends, adjusting to, I don't know, having an injury, any kind of area of life. I'm wondering what it is that, I guess the starting block would be awareness of what your helpful and unhelpful schemas are, which ones have served you, which ones continue not to serve you, as the center point of change. But I'm wondering what other elements there are to change. Think about someone who wants to change the way they're behaving or the way they're acting around other people, or the way they're responding to situations. What is it that you've learned from this that might be helpful to understand?
And I don't want to downplay awareness either. Like, if you're able to frequently catch yourself in real time, like repeating an old pattern, that is just, I'd trade that for most of the other strategies, that is, wow. Without that, then you're on autopilot. So yes, it's a starting block, but let's keep that as the central one. If we can continue to get closer and closer to real time, I suppose, mindful awareness of old patterns and old triggers, that's that's really the foundation.
I think what also, sorry, just to jump in, I think what also would probably seem helpful is if you understand the origins, you're then able to insert a bit more compassion into the way you approach
Great.
these situations.
Took the words right out of my mouth. Yeah.
Did I? Okay. Yeah. You're less likely. Imagine you'd be like less likely to berate yourself, or you can proceed more kindly to yourself, rather than being like, bloody hell, I'm doing this thing again. I always do this. It's ridiculous. I wish I didn't do that, rather than going, there's a reason. It's because XYZ happened when I was younger, or I've faced this many times and I've had to adjust. And I imagine that's a key part as well to the understanding.
So it's like, okay, how do I then, you could frame it another way. How do I then help meet the need that is predicting that's not going to go met here? So basically, if it's the, I don't know, I'll pick a different one just so we can throw a few out there, like you say. If there's one called defectiveness and shame, right? The sense that I'm sort of inherently, there's something wrong with me, or I'm not good enough, or something like that. So what does a child who feels defective and ashamed, how do they need to be treated to feel okay, right? And then we would do very well to treat the part of ourselves that way. So with that sort of encouraging but kind, sort of compassionate nature. And then, as you say, if we actually understand, so this is more an educational aspect, isn't it? If we actually understand where we've learned to feel that way, then it's much easier, as you say, to have compassion for that part of ourselves, because it's like, well, I was just a kid when I learned to feel like this.
It appears to me, kind of looking through some of the, I guess we are sort of jumping across to sort of, how to change, essentially. But it seems like a lot of parts of the change phase seem to be taken from other domains. So it seems like there's cognitive techniques, there's compassion-based techniques that we've you just spoke about, experiential techniques, pattern-breaking behavior. It seems like it takes a lot of inspiration from other, I guess, therapies or modes. And I know we're trying not to go too much down the sort of what would you do if you were in therapy with these, but I guess on a practical level, it seems like there's quite a lot of different strategies that seem quite exciting as well. But I guess the one that stands out to me, and probably the one that I find most interesting is, fighting the schema on an emotional level. So the more experiential techniques to sort of rewrite. I guess this is where you can answer, is it a matter of, are you rewriting the schema, or are you challenging the schema, or are you accepting that it's there and making a new one? Or what's the goal, I suppose, the
goal is, as you say, to challenge it on an emotional level. And that potentially is by, and like you point out, when you actually get down to like techniques or what can I actually do, it's just like infinite. It depends on your creativity, right? And what they list in the book isn't even going to be like what's possible. But some examples would be using that feeling to tap into imagery of when you felt like that in the past. And then within that imagery, and when I say imagery, I mean picturing the situation, picturing the colors, picturing the people, hearing the sounds, like closing your eyes and really tapping into this. And then like changing the situation so your need goes met. And you're not lying to yourself that this really happened in the past, but you're giving yourself the physical experience of, I don't know, that person being protected when they were otherwise going to be rejected or abandoned, or being looked after when they were publicly shamed, or whatever it might be. But I feel like we would do well to backtrack a bit, because we said about like how these schemas stay rigid, right, and stay like perpetual. And there's a big difference between the schema themselves and how we cope with them, our coping styles.
Yes, I'd love to hear more about that. Yeah.
And it's the coping styles really that perpetuate them. So it's really important to understand.
Right.
And it's the coping styles that we probably, when we notice patterns we get into that are probably unhelpful for us, it's probably our coping styles that we're noticing. So overthinking, drinking, like things that are problems for us. So you could ask the question, well, what does any animal have at their disposal as a defense when they're under threat, right? They have their fight, flight, and freeze response. And so we have sort of equivalent responses to dealing with these schemas. So they call the equivalent of the freeze a surrender. So I'm just accepting full on that the schema is true, so much so that I'm going to look at the world through it. It's familiar. I identify with it. I'm going to choose people who help me repeat it. I'm going to choose people who continue to not meet the needs that have gone unmet. And it's going to be perpetuated because I've surrendered to it. Then there's flight, which would be avoidance. I'm going to do everything I can to avoid the schema ever being triggered. I'm not going to put my, if it's abandonment, I'm just not going to get close to people. I'm going to drink if the feelings come up. Maybe I'm going to find ways to repress and avoid thinking about anything around closeness or abandonment. So that's another style to avoid the schema ever being triggered. And then the third one is fight, which would be to overcompensate. So that's to be the absolute opposite of what this schema. So if I don't know, if I don't feel good enough, if I feel defective, then I'm gonna strive to be, I don't know, it depends what it is in your culture or upbringing, but the richest person or the most famous person, or I'm going to be the best. I'm going to be the top dog in my circle, in my I'm the big fish in this pond, and that's going to help me feel good enough, supposedly. But I've actually overcompensated.
I was interested in this section on coping styles where it says an individual's temperament has a greater role in determining a patient's coping styles than it does in determining their schemas. It seems schemas are kind of run a bit, kind of deeper in a more, kind of experiential level of what happened to us in maybe our younger years, and obviously repeated patterns, not necessarily in young years, but, across our earlier years anyway. And then, how temperament has an effect on that. And I guess it's quite interesting to, I guess I was thinking about this, what is my general temperament and response to situations, and how that might affect how I respond to different ones. Like some of the emotional temperaments is, am I more labile or non-reactive, more dysthymic or optimistic? Am I more anxious or calm? And this can go different things for different situations. Am I more obsessive or distractible, passive or aggressive, irritable or cheerful, shy or sociable? I just thought the interplay there was quite interesting. And I guess because often when we're trying to make changes in our lives, maybe we think the greatest change comes from, what people imagine, like changing your personality or changing things like that. I guess it's interesting to think like whether making, whether temperament is something that can be changed, but whether that's the way to change. Because if that's got a greater influence on your coping styles, then maybe the core is around your temperament. But I'm sure it's not linear like that. It's a lot more circular.
It's so tricky, isn't it? Like, actually peeling apart which parts of your personality are nature versus nurture and everything in between. But it's quite an interesting idea that it's our unmet needs going unmet that determine our schemas or early maladaptive schemas. And just to be, I want to throw this in as well, and that is on a what do you call it? A continuum of severity. Yeah. So like we all need food, right? And we've probably all had the experience of going hungry to some degree, but there's obviously a spectrum. Like some people will have had, traumas of malnourishment at key formative years, which meant they would never be the height that they otherwise would have been. And some of us just have the odd occasion of being a bit hungry sometimes, and like everything in between, right? So in the same way, our emotional needs are no different. So because we call them schemas and we give them this labels, it's easy to think like, you have it or you don't sort of thing. But there's like a spectrum of how much any of us have ever felt, I don't know, abandoned or emotionally been in a cold environment or felt shamed by someone. Like it's going to be on a spectrum for all of us. But yes, then how we respond to that threat, like you say, that might be more based on temperament. So if I feel shamed, then if I'm more temperamentally shy, I might hide away and stick my head down. Whereas if I'm more temperamentally outgoing, I might become the joker and overcompensate or something like that. Yeah, it's interesting.
Interesting. Yeah, I guess it goes to show it's interesting to get a real, make a detailed assessment of like what is your actual responses to difficult situations. Like, you made a good point. Like, do you resort to humor? Do you just go quiet? Do you move towards? Do you like verbalize your frustrations, or do you tell someone else, or do you just tell nobody and internalize it?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. The way, the practical way in which you respond to these would give a level of insight into your coping style.
Right.
By the seams of things. Yeah.
And that's probably what you're going to notice, right? If you start reflecting and thinking, what are the patterns I sort of fall into, which I can see in the long term aren't good for me? They're probably going to be how you cope. Like, I don't know, isolating yourself, and then starting to feel lonely over time. That's probably an avoidance to being around people or closeness for some schema reason, for some unmet need. Like, you predict you're going to be hurt or abandoned, or people are going to find you boring, or whatever it's going to be for you.
I'm interested where you think we should move to next. What's kind of, because I'm reading headlines on, we've done a bit on schema perpetuation. Is there anything around schema healing or change you think we're ready to move on to? Or is there anything I've missed?
I reckon one more concept before the change, because part of the change process, right? You mentioned awareness, but what we're aiming to do? Well, we're aiming to be able to be more flexible in real time, right? To be able to adapt to new, novel circumstances, to take on new information that doesn't fit our old patterns, but still integrate it.
Yeah.
One way of framing that is they talk about, can we find our healthy adult? Like, can we find a part of us that is rational, that can assess things kind of logically, and perhaps offer some sort of need meeting function to our inner child parts? So that they call these parts modes, schema modes, and it's very similar. You and I did a games people play. We could
like transactional analysis.
Yeah, very similar to ego states and transactional analysis. So there is sort of, I don't know, if I said like you have an angry child part and maybe an inner critical parent part, you could probably get a feel for what I might mean by that. That we can, and depending on how integrated these modes or parts are, we might find ourselves, shifting into them and then taking the driving seat kind of unknowingly, or and then we just get stuck in them, or we can sort of move between them more integratedly. But you could find that, every week you go to therapy, for example, you might be in your healthy adult mode and you might be able to do all this self-analysis and whatnot. But then it's like when you really need to be switched on is when you're triggered into your angry child or your vulnerable child or your critical parent. But once you're there, that everything else you've learned is kind of offline, and then you're just stuck in this one mode of being. I don't. So
the schemas would kind of fit into these modes, so it's kind of more of a state you get into.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So the schemas are like, they're like volcanoes in the sense that they can just be lying dormant, or they can be triggered. But like a mode is maybe a set of schema or set of schemas and coping responses that comes out in our personality, they're like parts of us, different personas or different sub personalities that come out as a package. Okay,
interesting. Okay, and I guess I'm reading here is that there's 3 dysfunctional coping modes. There's the compliant surrenderer, the detached protector, and the overcompensator, who fights back by mistreating others. So they just correlate to the 3 coping styles, right? Yeah, okay, that would make sense.
Yeah. Okay. And so but they're the coping style personified. So
I was interested in what, just kind of flicking through, seeing there's some things around memory and how the memories are connected to schemas, and how, I guess eventually we'll move across to the change part, but what do you know about the impact of memory in terms of schemas and their ability to change? Are these are the memories we have kind of informing the schemas? Like we have a historical part of us, or there's a memory within us that we carry through us through, our sense of psychological continuity, that there's this memory that might stick with us that would inform the schema? Or are we able to challenge memories? Or I'm not quite sure what I'm asking, but memory, is there anything worth talking about there?
Well, memory for me is one of those kind of false concepts, in that let's say, can you remember how to ride a bike? Like your muscle memory of riding that bike might have been formed of, at least the first few hundred times you rode a bike, right? And every one of those 100 times might now inform your current muscle memory of riding a bike. So that's like procedural memory, right? It's embodied, and every one of those memories, every one of those experiences you had of riding a bike is important for that. But if I asked you to tell me the first 200 experiences of you riding your bike, you wouldn't be able to recall most of them, like the vast majority, right? So it's and so that recall memory is very different to that procedural memory. And when we're talking about schemas, we're really talking about that procedural, like the ingrained emotional, muscle, bodily kind of cognitive pattern memory. And yes, we might be able to recall particular instances of riding a bike which feed into that, but that's quite different from the, hope I've explained that. That's sort of ingrained.
No, great. Yeah. I'm curious, kind of moving on to the change phase. Are we looking to address and change things on a cognitive level, or an experiential level, or a habitual level? Like, is there kind of obviously there's multiple techniques of doing this, but I guess this book in particular, are they suggesting one way over the other, or are they suggesting a combination of them?
Yeah, so they suggest, like you say, so you can challenge it cognitively, emotionally, behaviourally, and interpersonally. So there are kind of 4 areas in which you can. Yes. They use quite military language, like they say, like do battle with and attack the schema, like you're just chipping away at the thing. And they suggest a sort of an order for at least 3 of them. Is that first you would challenge it cognitively, right? You would build a rational case for understanding why you feel the way you do in certain experiences, why you respond the way you do given your coping styles, why you do that based on your early life experiences, and why that is now unhelpful, and the beliefs in that schema are not rational based on your current position in life.
Yeah. Okay.
That doesn't necessarily change how much you feel or change the intensity of how motivated you are to drink or to avoid or to play the joker or whatever your defense is. But they say that the first key is to understand and challenge the schema, at least on a rational level. Like I get it. I get why I'm like this, and it makes sense. and it's not very helpful to me, and I would do well to find other strategies. So you've not changed how you feel, but you've made a case against it.
Within that, there'd need to be a willingness to change as well, which would be interesting. Like, that's the whole schema in itself, like, stubbornness to change.
Yeah.
Okay, and then I guess obviously once you've addressed it cognitively, like what can somebody think? So once they've got the awareness of what they're doing, maybe the history behind it, what are the day-to-day behaviors and the coping strategies and techniques they use to, kind of.
Well, then they suggest moving to challenging it emotionally, which we kind of touched on a bit. That would be that they the main technique they use there is imagery.
Yeah.
So actually using your mind's eye to remember and imagine situations where these schemas have been triggered, and use imagery to you can do a whole host of things. You can, if it's a childhood memory, you can come in as your current adult in the imagery and give that child what it needed at the time, and try to gain a felt sense of what it would have been like for that need to have gone met. If it's maybe an adult situation and you're looking at a coping strategy, you can imagine how you would sort of almost role play with yourself, how you would prefer to have handled that situation if you were in your healthy adult. Like, oh, actually in this interaction, I predicted, I predicted this person was judging me like that. So I got my head down and I slunk out of there. But maybe if this schema wasn't triggered and I was really in my healthy adult, I would have curiously asked them what they really meant and thought, and tested out my prediction. But I would actually imagine myself doing that, right, and see how that feels. So you're using imagery to really challenge your emotional experience. I think that's the takeaway.
And then interpersonally.
Well, okay, I would say that one to last. So the next one they would sort of suggest in the book is like cognitive, emotional, behavioural, and then the behavioural was actually trying out new behaviours in the world. So rather than just being an imagery, actually doing it in person and challenging old habits and like really building. I don't know. At that point, you'd use any behavioural therapy technique to build a strategy for acting counter to your usual coping strategies and doing things that force you to challenge the schema. So if one of them is like you avoid intimacy, you plan for a person you're going to open up to maybe and do it.
Okay. Is there any, I guess, could you give an example of a schema that can be addressed from a behavioral pattern breaking technique? Is there like a schema we haven't spoken about today, then you can give a behavior breaking technique for?
In a way, behavior is not part of the schema. How we behave is part of our coping strategy.
Okay. Yeah.
So our schema is our belief, but you might have person A and person B with the same schema, but they might behave in very different ways in order to avoid or counterattack it, right?
Yes. Okay.
So when you're talking about behavioral pattern breaking, you're talking about challenging your coping strategies, which is slightly different to challenging the schema. But inevitably, by not doing your usual coping strategy, you're going to trigger your schema, which is when you're going to need your emotional resources and your healthy adult to look after yourself, right?
Interesting.
And your cognitive part to then reassess the new information that's coming in. If I've avoided being open and close to anyone for a decade and I start behaviourally challenging that, then my old schema, as soon as I do it, my old schema is going to like start predicting that they're, I don't know, judging me, that they're bored, that they're ignoring me. So I'm going to need the cognitive resources that I've built before then to be like, okay, pause. This is your old pattern predicting this of them. Actually think, maybe what's the alternative that they might be thinking, or risk asking them and seeing what they say. That's why the behavioral one comes last, because you need your cognitive and emotional resources for when you challenge your old coping strategies.
And thinking in terms of, I know we've discussed, atomic habits and other.
That would be a great book for someone in the behavioural pattern breaking stage.
Yeah. I was going to say, and also, I guess when we think about, internal and external motivations to change, I imagine, once we understand ourselves, we have a compassionate view of ourselves, and we can experientially have an idea of what it's like to behave differently. Like, when I do open up to someone, I'm not, destroyed or I don't have a death of sorts. Then that is I guess another reason or a stimulus to continue behavior pattern breaking. I think circular in a way.
And that's where the interpersonal one comes in, right? I know I saved it till last, but like actually having another person who does respond differently, right? Who so build it, like, I don't know, making old schemas more flexible is based on getting new information that challenges the schema, right? So to have new information, you actually need other people who do respond differently than your caregivers did when these first schemas were originally developed. So that's where the interpersonal bit comes in. It's at the end of the day, you can challenge this cognitively, you can challenge it emotionally, and you can break old behaviors. But off the back of breaking those old behaviors, you need other people on the end of that will provide you with new experiences that are going to challenge the schemas.
Because the healing is in the relationship, and I guess the schemas exist in the first place in relation to other people as well. So
so that's where, like,
in relation to other people,
that's where a therapist, you can hopefully sort of guarantee, at least to as much as a degree you can, that they will help be that other person for you. But we also might know, like, we might have friends and families and partners, whatever, in our lives already that can perform those functions if we let them in, if we risk challenging our old ways of being.
Oh, interesting. I feel it's fascinating. I think I think we I've learned a lot from this. I think it's fantastic. I think it'd just be, I wonder, just for people listening, whether it might just be worth kind of wrapping up and maybe just naming what the schemas are. Yeah. And I suppose if there's any, if I just read out a handful and you just stop me if there's one you would like to talk about. But so the first lot of unconditional schemas. So I believe this is the 18. So there's the abandonment instability. There's the mistrust and abuse. There's emotional deprivation. Maybe jump in if they don't sound as obvious. Defectiveness, which we spoke about. Social isolation.
So those are the first 5 of that first domain. So you've got your need for safety and security. If it's not met, that's this domain of disconnection and rejection. And these are the first 5 schemas in that domain. So if how can your need for safety go unmet? Well, if you're abandoned, obviously it's going unmet. If you're abused and you can't trust people, obviously it's going unmet. But then a bit more subtly, if you're emotionally deprived, right? Maybe you've got a stable home, but it's emotionally cold. So, and you're not given much physical affection, you're not given much empathy. So that's the third one. If you're kind of shamed or sort of led to believe you're not good enough, criticized, that's that defectiveness, shamed one. And social isolation, well, maybe your home life is okay, but you're just not integrated into the outside world. You don't have friends, you're locked away from society or something like that. And then, so that you can see yourself as isolated and alienated. So those are the first 5 ones about safety and security.
Great. I like that we're kind of blocking them. So then there's dependence / incompetence, vulnerability to harm or illness, enmeshment, underdeveloped self, and failure. Does that go into domain to impaired autonomy and performance? Is that where that one goes?
So that's the domain of, so the need is to sort of be free to function independently in the world. You know, as you grow from a child to an adult, at some point you need to be able to slowly break away from the family and function as an independent person. But yeah, there are, I suppose, the 4 ways in which that might not happen, that might go unmet, is you're made to feel that you're dependent, so you kind of not let go of that sort of Freudian mother idea. Vulnerability to harm, so maybe you know, you've got caregivers who are excessively scared about you getting ill or injured, and that leads you to be scared about exploring the world. Enmeshed or underdeveloped self, you sort of I suppose that's quite similar to dependence, but rather than putting down your capacity to be independent, it's like you and your caregivers are one unit. You've not been allowed to have an individuality of your own.
Yes. Yeah. Okay.
And failure. Yeah. They're all kind of similar, aren't they? But the idea that I'm a failure. I'm always going to be a failure. I'm always going to fail at everything I do.
The next ones is negativity / pessimism, punitiveness, entitlement and grandiosity, and insufficient self-control and self-discipline. So I imagine that
I think
that falls into
might have mixed
limits.
up a few.
Yeah.
The impaired limits has the 2 schemas: the entitlement, grandiosity, and the insufficient self-control, discipline.
Yeah, and then the other ones Well, that's typically like if you're spoiled and you're led to believe you're better than everyone else and that you don't have to have the same boundaries that everyone else in society does. Yeah. And then there is subjugation and self-sacrifice, approval seeking and recognition seeking.
That's the other directedness thing where you have to basically be a caregiver to your caregivers.
And finally, emotional inhibition and unrelenting standards / hypercriticalness.
Yeah. So that's the one where you haven't had the freedom to play and be spontaneous and
Overvigilance and inhibition is that domain.
Yeah.
Cool. Nice. I thought it was quite good to finish on that. Sort of just name them all and categorize them. I think that was quite helpful. Thank you. Nice one, mate. That's been really interesting. I think it's like a great refresher. I feel like we managed to kind of keep it pretty concise and applicable to everyone, hopefully. Is there anything kind of you wanted to mention that we haven't mentioned at all? Or
no, I mean, like it took the full hour just to sort of cover all the key concepts, really, didn't it? Like, I suppose it leads me wanting to ask you: is there anything like, now you've learned all that, or I know you knew some of it already, but like now we've ingrained all that, is there anything that comes up for you that you want to say as a takeaway or ask? Or
I think as a takeaway, I was quite interested in how the temperament informs the coping style. I guess I never kind of viewed them as closely aligned as what they were, and I guess it feels easier to understand the coping style and maybe access alternatives if I know like what the on the ground behavioural and temperamental style I bring to that coping style. So like what kind of just gets me angry, or what do I kind of try and make jokes about just to kind of to avoid, or what, like I think that's the real, it kind of falls into the realm of like, what's my personality and how does that serve me, I guess, in a way. And I really I liked that a lot, because it's sort of, there's many levels that this is running on, but it's sort of like on a day-to-day level, like how I act and behave and what it's like to be Will, like, is that helpful or not? I guess, yeah. So like the schemas and stuff, they're sort of can be kind of abstract, and if you've not got a great memory, they're sort of related to things that are distant. But like the actual day-to-day life, in terms of this theory, is more built around
your sort of coping responses and how that's based, maybe like you say, on temperament, and that's what might be easiest to first get in touch with and actually feel on a day-to-day basis.
Great to chat again, mate. And
yeah, nice one. Thanks for that.
Yes,
it's helpful to go through it all off script.
Wonderful. Yeah, good stuff, mate. All right, always a pleasure. Much love, and look after yourself.
Take care, mate. Cheers.
See you, mate.
Bye.
Bye.